a 70-year-old man's hidden past that shattered his family. Harold Bennett had always been a man of few words. At 70 years old, his voice had grown soft with age, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding in ways that didn't require volume. His three children, Emily, Michael, and Daniel, had grown accustomed to his silences, though each of them carried a different interpretation of what those silences meant. To Emily, the youngest, her father's quiet nature was proof of his wisdom. To Michael, the eldest, it was discipline and control. But to Daniel, the middle child, silence had always felt like distance, like a wall built between them. Their mother had passed away a decade earlier, leaving Harold alone in the family home, a modest two-story house on the outskirts of town. Emily visited often, bringing him groceries, tidying up the garden, and fussing over his health. Michael managed the larger tasks, repairs, financial matters, ensuring the house was in order. Daniel, however, visited rarely. His relationship with his father was complicated, fraught with old resentments that time had never softened. It was Emily who first noticed the change. Harold had grown more withdrawn than usual, his eyes lingering too long on old photographs, his hands trembling when he thought no one was looking. She worried about his health, but when she asked him, he would only smile faintly and say, "Just age catching up, sweetheart." Yet behind his weary smile, Emily sensed something heavier. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the family gathered for Sunday dinner, a tradition Emily insisted on keeping alive, Harold seemed particularly distracted. He barely touched his food, and his gaze drifted often to the window as though something beyond the falling leaves held his attention. "Dad, you're awfully quiet tonight," Emily said gently, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I'm always quiet," Harold replied with a small chuckle, but the attempt at humor fell flat. Michael frowned. "You're quieter than usual, something on your mind." Daniel, who had been pushing food around his plate more than eating, muttered under his breath, "He always has something on his mind, just never says it." The tension in the room thickened. Emily shot Daniel a warning look, but Harold's expression didn't change. He simply folded his hands and stared at them as though they might reveal an answer he had long been searching for. That night, after Emily had gone home and Michael had left with his family, Daniel lingered. He stood by the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, watching his father as he sat in the armchair by the fire. The old man looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of his years had finally pressed him into a version of himself he could no longer hide behind. "What are you holding back, Dad?" Daniel asked suddenly. His voice was sharper than he intended, edged with decades of unspoken grievances. "You sit there staring at nothing like you've got the whole world on your shoulders. What is it? Another lecture you never gave me, another truth you're too proud to admit." Harold didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his eyes meeting his son with a depth that startled Daniel. For a long moment, the fire crackled between them, filling the silence that neither seemed able to break. Finally, Harold spoke. "There are things I should have told you long ago," he said softly. "Things I've kept buried because I was afraid of what they would do to this family." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Afraid of what they would do to you, you mean?" Harold's lips trembled into a faint, sad smile. "Maybe both." Daniel left that night without pressing further, but the seed had been planted. Harold's words gnawed at him, replaying in his mind until they became an obsession. The following week, Harold fell ill. It was nothing severe at first, just fatigue, dizziness, a lingering cough, but it was enough for Emily to demand a doctor's visit. Tests were run, and while the diagnosis wasn't immediately life-threatening, it was clear that Harold's health was fragile. He would need care, rest, and most of all, honesty with his children about his condition. But Harold's mind wasn't solely on his health. He knew time was slipping away, and with it, the chance to set things right. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in hues of orange and gold, Harold gathered his children. Emily and Michael sat on the couch while Daniel leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. Harold stood before them, leaning on his cane, his face lined with shadows of regret. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice unsteady, "something I should have told you years ago." The room grew still. Even Daniel, skeptical as ever, felt a flicker of unease. "When I was a young man, before I met your mother, I made choices that changed the course of my life. Choices I thought I could bury and forget, but secrets have a way of living on, even when you try to kill them." Emily reached for his hand. "Dad, whatever it is, you don't have to be afraid, we love you." Harold's eyes glistened. He looked from Emily to Michael to Daniel, and then he spoke the words that fractured the fragile image of their family. "I had another family, another son, before any of you were born." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael blinked as though trying to process words that didn't make sense. Emily's mouth fell open, her hand slipping from her father's. Daniel's face hardened, his suspicions finding confirmation in a revelation that struck like lightning. "You what?" Michael said at last, his voice strained. Harold sank into his chair, his hands trembling. "It was before your mother. I was young, foolish, scared. The woman I loved then, she became pregnant. We were going to marry, but I lost my nerve. I walked away. I thought I could start fresh, build a new life. And I did, with your mother, with all of you, but that choice, it never left me." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. "You mean we have a brother?" Harold nodded slowly. "Yes, his name is Daniel too." At that, the middle son stiffened. His name, spoken in such a way, felt like a cruel twist of fate. "You named me after him," Daniel said, his voice like ice. Harold closed his eyes, pain etched across his face. "I thought it was a way of carrying him with me, of honoring the life I abandoned, but I realize now it was selfish. It was a burden I placed on you without ever telling you why." Daniel's fists clenched. "All these years I thought you looked at me like a disappointment, like I was never good enough, and now I know why. You weren't looking at me, you were looking at him." Harold began, but his son cut him off. "No, you don't get to explain this away." Michael stood, packing the room, his mind reeling. "Does Mom know? Did she know?" "She knew pieces," Harold admitted. "I told her enough to ease my conscience. But not enough to hurt her. She forgave me, but I never forgave myself." Emily pressed her hands to her face, tears streaming down. "All this time you carried this alone. Why didn't you trust us?" "Because I didn't want to lose you," Harold whispered. "I didn't want you to see me the way I see myself." The family unraveled that night. Michael stormed out, unable to reconcile the image of his steadfast father with the flawed man before him. Emily stayed, crying softly, trying to hold the pieces together. And Daniel left with rage burning in his chest, a lifetime of unanswered questions now replaced with a truth that cut deeper than he could bear. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter, colder. Emily visited often, torn between love and disappointment. Michael kept his distance, answering calls but avoiding face-to-face meetings. Daniel didn't return at all. Harold spent his days writing in a journal, letters to each of his children that he wasn't sure they would ever read. He wandered through the garden, his cane sinking into the soil, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Regret was a constant companion, but so was a fragile hope that his children might one day forgive him, even if he never forgave himself. Weeks passed before Daniel returned. He came late one evening, his face shadowed with exhaustion, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He found his father in the living room, asleep in his chair, a half-written letter resting on his lap. Daniel picked it up, his eyes scanning the shaky handwriting. It was addressed to him. "My son, my namesake," it began. "I don't expect your forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll understand. You were never second best. You were my second chance." Daniel's throat tightened as he read. For the first time, he saw not just the father who had disappointed him, but the man who had lived his life haunted by the ghosts of his choices. When Harold stirred awake, his eyes opened to find Daniel watching him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel held out the letter. "You should have given me this sooner." "I was afraid," Harold admitted. Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, me too." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't empty either. It was a beginning, fragile, uncertain, but real. The days after Daniel's return carried a different weight in the Bennett household. Something had shifted, though it wasn't simple forgiveness, nor was it complete reconciliation. It was more like the fragile truce of two travelers pausing on opposite sides of a broken bridge, both unsure whether to cross, but aware that the distance between them had narrowed. Emily noticed the change immediately. When she visited, she found Daniel in the kitchen with Harold, the two of them sitting in silence, sipping tea. They barely spoke, yet the air between them no longer bristled with hostility. Emily didn't intrude. She simply watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with cautious hope. Michael, however, remained distant. He called to check on their father, but his voice was clipped, his tone practical. He spoke of doctor appointments, medication refills, household bills, never of feelings, never of the secret that had torn them apart. It was Emily who urged him to return. "He doesn't have much time," she said one evening over the phone, her voice cracking. "Please, Michael, don't let it end like this." Michael hesitated, his silence stretching into the line until Emily thought he might hang up. At last he sighed, "I'll think about it." Winter descended, blanketing the town in frost and quiet. Harold grew weaker, his once steady hands trembling even as he tried to hold a teacup. His voice faltered more often, his breath shorter. The doctor spoke gently but directly. Time was slipping away. Emily doubled her visits, cooking soups and fussing over blankets. Daniel began stopping by more often as well, sometimes with his daughter Claire. She was 14, observant and sensitive to the shifting dynamics around her. She adored her grandfather but had always sensed the rift between him and her father. One evening she sat sketching Harold as he dozed in his chair, her pencil gliding across the page with quiet precision. "Why do you draw me, Claire?" Harold asked softly when he opened his eyes. She smiled shyly, "Because I want to remember you, even when you're not here." Harold's throat tightened. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched her sketchbook. "Then remember me with all my flaws, child. Don't let anyone tell you I was more or less than I was." Daniel watched the exchange silently, his chest heavy with conflicting emotions. Seeing his daughter's tenderness toward Harold forced him to confront the truth. Resentment had stolen years he could never reclaim, not just from himself but from Claire too. One snowy afternoon, Michael finally returned. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, almost like a stranger. Harold looked up from his chair, frail but alert, his eyes brightening at the sight of his eldest son. "Michael," he whispered, his voice cracking. Michael swallowed hard and stepped inside. "Emily wouldn't stop calling, said I'd regret it if I didn't come." Harold chuckled weakly. "She's right, she always has been." The reunion was awkward at first, filled with stilted conversation about weather, repairs, and old memories. But as the hours passed, something softened. Michael, who had always carried himself with the sternness of a man shouldering too much responsibility, finally allowed himself to just be a son. That evening, the three siblings sat together with their father for the first time in months. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Harold leaned back in his chair, his eyes glistening as he looked at them. "I never thought I'd see this again," he murmured. "All of you together, even if only for a moment." "Don't talk like that," Emily whispered, tears in her eyes. "I must," Harold said softly, "because moments are all we're promised now." He told them stories that night, of his youth, of the mistakes he made, of the love he had for their mother. He spoke not as a father commanding respect, but as a man laying bare his soul. The siblings listened, each of them carrying their own grief, their own anger, their own longing. And for the first time they saw Harold not as the figure who had loomed large over their lives, but as a flawed human being who had tried, failed, and loved in imperfect ways. In the weeks that followed, Harold grew weaker still. He spent more time in bed, his journal filling with shaky words meant for his children. Emily found him one morning writing a letter addressed to Michael. She didn't read it, but she slipped it into an envelope and placed it carefully on the dresser. As December deepened, Harold asked for one thing: a Christmas together. The family obliged. Emily decorated the house with garlands and lights. Michael brought a tree, and Daniel arrived with Claire carrying boxes of ornaments that had gathered dust in his basement. They trimmed the tree together, laughter and bickering filling the house in equal measure. For a moment, it felt like years of bitterness and secrets had melted away, leaving only the warmth of family. Harold sat by the fire, watching with tears in his eyes. "This," he whispered to Emily, who knelt beside him to adjust his blanket, "this is what I wanted, not forgiveness, not absolution, just this." On Christmas Eve, Harold gathered his children once more. His voice was faint, his breath shallow, but his words carried weight. "Promise me something," he said. "Stay together, don't let my mistakes become your chains, let forgiveness be your inheritance." Emily clasped his hand, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I promise." Michael nodded, his jaw tight but his eyes wet. "I promise too." Daniel hesitated, his chest heavy with the weight of years. At last he whispered, "I'll try, that's the best I can promise, but I'll try." Harold smiled faintly, "That's all I ask." That night snow fell gently outside, blanketing the world in silence. Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the family he had both wounded and cherished. Emily held one hand, Michael the other, while Daniel sat at the foot of the bed, Claire beside him. His last breath was soft, almost like a sigh of relief. The days that followed were filled with grief but also with unexpected healing. At the funeral, Emily spoke of her father's kindness, of the lessons he taught her. Michael spoke of responsibility, of the strength Harold had instilled in him. And Daniel, his voice unsteady but resolute, told the truth. "My father was not a perfect man," he said. "He made choices that hurt us all. For years I hated him. I thought he never loved me, but in the end I realized he did. Not perfectly, not always in ways I understood, but he loved me. And love, even when flawed, is still love. That is what I'll carry with me." Afterward, the siblings stood together outside the church, snowflakes melting in their hair. Emily slipped her arms around her brothers, holding them close. "For him," she said softly. "For him," Michael echoed. Daniel looked away, his throat tight, then he nodded. "For him." In the months that followed, the Bennets began to rebuild, not perfectly, not without setbacks, but with intention. They gathered for dinners, birthdays, small celebrations. They spoke of Harold often, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a man whose life had been both mistake and miracle. And when Claire showed them the sketch she had drawn of her grandfather, frail yet smiling, eyes bright with unspoken love, they understood what Harold had meant when he asked to be remembered with all his flaws. Because in the end, it wasn't the secret that defined him. It was the fragile, stubborn love that endured despite it all. And that, more than anything, was the legacy he left behind.